1 year with my 2023 TC250, thoughts and feelings, and how I feel after having my TC250 for 1 year. JetBoyCo merch coming January of 2024. Make sure to subscribe to JetBoyCo, follow JetBoyCo on social media so that you can get the drop when it comes. We've got a ton of cool stuff lined up, and I'm really excited for you guys all to join in. Welcome back to the Dirt Bike Lifestyle, everybody. At the beginning of the year, and when I first got my beloved 2023 TC250, I did a video on all of the things that I was ecstatic about, all of the things that I talked about, why I liked this bike, why I chose this bike, how I ended up here, all of those things. And I got a lot of feedback from it. People loved it. And so I want to give you guys a review of 1 year with this bike. One of the things that I got the most was people saying, thanks for letting me know what you thought about this bike, especially about the fuel injection and why I liked that. And that was the one thing that I told everybody, was that when I got this bike, it was like riding a 4-stroke. I said that time after time. It was like, after riding this bike, the way that it reacted was like a 4-stroke, because you have that fuel injection. It just smoothed out the power. It was easier to ride. It wasn't so like raw, ripping out of your hands. And I really liked that. I enjoyed that. That was one of those things that, like, being that it was a 23, this is a new thing. Like, we had nothing to compare it to. And at that time, the bike was brand new. Now, a year later, right? How do I feel about that same statement? I'm indifferent. Because at the end of the year, I rode a 21 or 20 KTM 250 SX, which was carbureted. I can't compare it to my 300 in the background because it's a 300, it's different. So it was like, oh, I haven't ridden a 252 stroke that was carbureted in a while. So what did I think between the 23 and that carbureted model? The carbureted model was actually harder hitting. Well, why? Because that carbureted, for me as a racer, I wanted the snap. I wanted the raw, there's one hill at Cambridge, our local sand track, where you come down the hill and then you got to power up a sand hill. And having that just when it hit, it was pulling. And that was one thing that on this bike, you have to carry your speed more, because the power has been more like linear and a smoother roll on, because it's that fuel injection. You have to carry your speed. It didn't have that hit. The aggressive map helped with that, but it wasn't the same as riding a bike that was carbureted. So that was one thing that, although I just had to ride the bike differently. It wasn't like you could come into the corner, drop the clutch, and just brawl, like you could on the older bike. You had to carry your speed, because when you would go for that, if you came in and you kind of slowed up and then went to drop it, it just took a little bit more. It could recover from it. It wouldn't bog as much, but it just wasn't as hard hitting and snappy as a carbureted bike is. So although it is a good thing and it's something that I liked about this bike, in a racing perspective, it was less ideal because it wasn't just that hard hitting. But on the bright side, it made me carry my speed through the corners. It made me roll the corners better, which ultimately helped my racing abilities. So it's not a bad thing. It just was, if you're after that real hard hit, you want to come out of the corner and just maybe a carbureted bike is a better choice, because it's got that hit, where this is going to be a little bit smoother. It's going to roll. It's going to be a little bit better for carrying your speed and, just rolling and more of a smoother power. It's not so 2-stroke. You get the 2-stroke, but just kind of a tamed down version, tame as in just because it was more smooth. And so if you're that guy that's looking for, the real hard grunt of a 2-stroke, that the carbureted Husky gas KTM models are going to be a little bit closer to like the YZ carbureted version than they are fuel injected. So after riding it for, putting 60 hours on it, I would say that after doing like my first top ends and top end change on this bike, that was kind of where things changed for me. It just wasn't the same bike after about 30 hours. I don't know if that was due to the way that the top end was rebuilt, the gaskets that I was using, the parts being worn out, etc. Resetting that TPS sensor and adjusting that. Like, I don't know if it was, there's a few different factors going on there, so I don't know where that came in, but it just wasn't quite the same bike. Given that's doing it at 30 hours, and a bike, when you have it 0 hours, it's tight, it's fresh, everything is fresh on it. And I feel like also it was rejuvenating because it was like a new bike, so I'm just hyped on it. But after, it just wasn't quite the same. It was a little bit slower, it was a little bit laggier, it just wasn't quite the same. Was that a turnoff for me? Yes, but it wasn't a bad thing. It just was like the bike just had a different feel than it did when I first got it, and given that the parts were worn and things like that. But was it a bad thing? No, but it did change for me, and from there I ended up kind of bouncing around and trying different things. I ended up going to a single ring piston with Nemura, and that also changed things for me a little bit. It helped the bike, it made the bike run good. Like, it made it run better than it was kind of previously. They helped me, get it dialed in. And so having that single ring piston, that was the first time in a 250 as well, and that did really well. This bike runs well with, like, they just did a good job of matching that single ring with the fuel injection. So that helped, but the power just wasn't quite the same. It was just a little bit less than it was when I first got it. Bad thing? No, not at all. Just, I want to let you know that it was a little bit different and made me feel different about the bike. Everybody knows that when you're rebuilding a two-stroke top end, it's like half hour deal, right? It's easy, it's simple. I would say that on the 23, this thing, two things. So one, this thing has way more bolts, just like a four-stroke is. Like the 21 or 2022 and before, those bikes, I mean, you could take 4 bolts off and you're literally at the top end, right? Like, so easy. This had a lot more bolts. There's a lot more, the plastics, just, there's a lot more going on to get to the top end. But when you get to the top end, taking apart the top end, so much simpler, because on the old bike, you'd have to take off the power valve connections and stuff like that on the engine. Whereas this bike, you've got 3 bolts on your TPS, and you can pull that off, and then you can just pull the jug off. You don't have to pull both sides off and pull the bolts out. The nice part is all of your top end or jug bolts are on the outside, so you don't have to pull pieces out to get to those bolts. That made just taking it off, like, getting to it took longer than actually taking it off, and I really liked that. So that made, like, just doing top ends a breeze on this thing. I didn't, I literally, the last top end that I did it in 2 hours, I think, to go from this to pulling the top end, inspecting it, reeds as well. I was inspecting because I was taking the subframe up, pulling all these things out. I did all of that in 2 hours, and it was a lot because they made it easier to get to the top end. So that's one thing that in the first video I had no idea, and now after 60 hours, compared to my 300, I actually preferred doing the top end on this bike because it was so much simpler. I was doing top ends on my bikes about 20 hours-ish, and there's a lot of stuff out there. There's a lot of good Facebook groups that talk about when you need to be doing your service, like, service intervals, things like that, and people having different intervals. I was actually just on one of those groups and saw some guy that had 72 hours on his bike and was saying, hey, when should I do a top end? And somebody commented, probably right now, because you should be doing them. Husky's recommending every 15 hours. I have buddies that have Yamahas and they're doing them every 15 hours, given it's a different bike for a different day. But with these, like, yeah, that 15 to 20 hour mark is right about where you want it to be. I did 3 top ends on this bike within 60 hours. And that kept, that was one thing that, like, I got a good bike. It lasted, the whole time. I always did my top ends preventatively, and I never had an issue. I did just take the bike in because I went to reset the power valve after doing the last top end and it didn't work. It ended up being that my TPS sensor, the actual sensor, went bad. And I believe that in one of my videos that I'll link here, I had a little bit of a crash, and what I was explained to at the dealer was that some of these little electronic pieces don't quite have the shock absorption, that when they take that hard hit, it doesn't like that, and so it reacts differently, and sometimes it can make these pieces go bad on the bike. And so ultimately, I think when I crashed and kind of slammed the ground and the bike was running, I think the issue was that it slammed and then it was still running kind of upside down, and so the sensors kind of tweaked, and it didn't have that, like, some of those bushings or whatever on there to help absorb that. And so they were like, it's kind of a KTM thing in a sense, or a Husky or gas thing, because they need to add a little bit of absorption. And of course, this is the first year that this bike had this, so down the road, this is something that they're going to obviously cover and they're going to figure out. And it's just the first year. When you buy a bike that's the first year of a 23 and it's the first year of fuel injection, I mean, imagine the issues that they had when they built the first two-stroke. It was so long ago that obviously it's come a long way to get to the point where you can ride it without issues. But when they first had them, there was inevitable issues. The same thing goes for this. It's not a big deal. It happens. The nice part is that there's so much online content now that's easily available to get the information that you need. I mean, I was going on these Facebook groups and, going through a post going, okay, I saw something that was similar to this. I'm going to try this on my bike and see if that, correlates. And I've taken that information to my dealer and been like, hey, this is the issue I'm having. This is what I've read about other people, what can we do here? And having them help me, get things figured out. So that being said, like, there was some little funky things, but it's not like any big deal, and it's not something that, like, you should be worried about when buying a 2024, because they're going to be, you have to monitor it, yes, but is it something that should deter you or steer you away from buying this bike? No, definitely not. Before I get into those, check out this very cool JetBoyCo hat with some very cool JetBoyCo inside taping. We've got high quality JetBoyCo logos on the front and back that are stitched on, sweatband logos. These are all coming in an upcoming merch release. Make sure to check out JetBoyCo.com to get yourself a hat like this. One of the first things that I did that I've done on a lot of my bikes, I'm a taller guy, so adding the Guts seat and the high seat foam was something that I did almost immediately. Why? It gives me space between my foot pegs and where I sit. It also added grip on the bike. When I was standing, my legs were, my knees, where my knees were gripping was almost over top of the seat. So I'm squishing in on the seat with more of my legs. Whereas when I had the tall seat, I was more using my knees than like, my legs. And that made a big deal. I was able to control the bike a little bit better. And that was something that was relatively inexpensive that I feel like gets passed up a lot. So if you're a taller guy or are feeling like you don't have enough grip in your knees, check out Guts and the Guts Racing high seat foam. I believe it's plus 30 millimeters on the seat foam. I went with the regular seat foam. I didn't go harder or softer. I just kept it stock, but just went higher. That made a big difference for me, and that would be something that I've recommended to several of my friends who also own Husky gas bikes, and they've also been able to benefit in that same way. One of the next things that I did on my bike, I went to my bar bend of choice. I took the stock bars off and went to my bar bend of choice. I ultimately talked to a friend who was like, I was like, why are you running those bars? And he was like, I really like the stock bars. I actually went back to them and tried them. I was running a crossbar at the time, and the stock bars are crossbarless. or have just the fat bar. And that was actually one thing that I did, and I actually did that on both of my bikes. As I went back to the stock bar, I went to the fat bar. Personally, the reason that I did that was I felt like there was a little bit more flex in the bar. The bar was less rigid in my hands and ultimately gave me a little bit more control. I enjoyed that. I like the bar. I found that I like the bar being closer to the forks. So between where my hands are and the top of the forks, I like that closeness, where before I've had the bars be higher, and so that distance between here and here is bigger. That was one thing that having that being closer, even as a tall guy, I liked that. I liked that control. Another thing that I did on my bike was I went away from, so I'm running a 1350 setup for sprocket choice. Why? I personally prefer that. I liked the way that that handled. It gave I was running a 14 before, and when I was going to grab the next gear, I was having to rev out longer, and it wasn't grabbing that next gear, which was making it hard for me in a section where there's a bull corner into a set of whoops, and then up into a set of whoops that continued up over a jump through a long section, and grabbing fourth is ultimately where I wanted to go. But getting to that was hard because you come out of the corner right into the whoops, and you're having to go second in the corner, immediately grab third, pull third as long as you can, and grab fourth to really drive, up over this jump. That was hard with that 1450 gearing. So I went 1350, made my life a lot better. 20, 30 bucks for front sprocket, probably even less at your local dealer or online would be a good choice, and would be something that, again, relatively inexpensive, that could help your bike. And a lot of the times, sprocket setup, make sure to look into that stuff, because that can help a lot. Like, I mean, a lot of this stuff, you can do all sorts of crazy mods, but if you have your sprocket setup wrong, you're not gonna be able to benefit from something like that. So just doing little things like that makes a big difference. I have two other things that I did. I did exhaust on my bike. Did it make the bike different? Yes. But was it as good as it was the stock? So KTM, Husky, Gas, their bikes are quote unquote ready to race. They build them according to that stock mapping, the stock exhaust, etc. I went to the FMF full system. Did I like it, and do I like it? Yes. Did I need it? Probably not. The stock bikes sound really good. Do they pull a little bit longer with the other exhaust on there? Yeah, a little bit, but for the money, honestly, that stock exhaust is pretty dang good on these bikes, especially the fuel injected, because it's a new bike. So Gas Husky KTM group has spent the last 4 years, 5 years. I mean, they've been testing this bike for several years before they even released it. They built the bike around that exhaust, right? But then once the bike was released, then the exhaust manufacturers come in and they're just hammering the testing, trying to make an exhaust for this bike. The reason that I say this is after adding aftermarket exhaust, I didn't notice a great deal of difference. And I think that's because these bikes were built around the stock exhaust and not aftermarket. So give the aftermarket people a few years to really, I mean, truthfully, if you're getting the aftermarket exhaust at this point on the 23, 24s, you're doing it for the sound. I mean, people are saying there's a little bit of difference, but is there a ton? Compared to a carbureted bike, I don't think so. I noticed more of a difference when I put the exhaust on my carbureted bike than I did on this bike, because I think that the KTM group built the bike around that stock exhaust, and so that stock exhaust performs really well. The one that I wanted to save for the last was suspension. This one is something that I had some troubles with at the beginning. Like the stock exhaust, or the stock suspension on my 23 was something that, in all honesty, I didn't feel comfortable on. I had my 21 stock suspension to compare to, and I loved the 21 stock stuff. So good. Some of my favorite suspension I have ever had. I felt like I was riding on a couch on that stuff. I loved it. Was the 23 stuff the same? No, it wasn't. I felt sketchy. It didn't feel predictable to me. And I ultimately, I wrote it. I just wasn't to the ability that I could be at. And it was because of that. So to combat that, what I did was I went to my local suspension guy, fine-tuned suspension, great people.
Just like that, we've got our Raven kit. Fine-tuned suspension coming through in the final hours before the trip, getting me dialed in, getting me set up with some dope MX Tech Raven forks. We ditched the air fork, so we're done with the air fork. These are both now spring forks,
and they helped me get into spring stuff. So I converted the front to the MX Tech Raven kit, and then had him update the shock with just a spring and a bladder kit and the piston to make it a little bit better. And that made a huge difference for me. I felt immediately comfortable on this bike, and a lot of people have said that the spring stuff is better on these bikes, and I fully agree. My 21 has springs in the front, and my 23 has springs in the front, and it's hands down so much better than the air. Like these bikes, although they're developed with air, they, in my opinion, are better with springs in them. Yes, it's a hard sell because it's expensive. It's hard to spend a lot of money on a bike and then spend another couple $1,000s on suspension. The one thing that my suspension guy told me was, the nice part is that if you spend the money on the suspension, you can carry it over to later year models. KTM, Husqvarna, Gas, they do a great job of building the suspension to be interchangeable between their models, and that benefits the consumer, us dirt bike lifestyle riders, to be able to move it bike to bike. So he was like, if you spend this money now, you can save it, just move it to another bike, and it's a good investment. Was he right? Yes, totally. Night and day difference. I immediately felt comfortable. I got it set up, I put it on, and I literally, so to give you an example of how comfortable I felt, I bought the suspension, I picked it up on Friday night, I put it on my bike, I loaded my bike into my van, I drove 24 hours to Florida, and then rode on Monday at PAX Tracks. First time, I'd ridden it with the air stuff, but never with the spring stuff until I got to Florida. Got to Florida, immediately felt comfortable. I was like, this is the bee's knees. I love this stuff. There's like the 6500 conversion kit from WP. I've heard that has equally as good reviews. Is it worth the money? Yes. Like as much as it goes, I don't want to, it's worth it. Like that is something that I back. Like I would tell you to go to springs. It makes the bike so much better, more predictable, better handling. It settles in the corners. It does what you want it to do. And ultimately it made this bike so much more fun for me. Let's start with my first issue. After my first top end, I brought the bike to Redbud, and the bike just wasn't running right. It ended up being my base gaskets were incorrect, and so it was too close, so I was getting really hot, almost like too hot exhaust coming out of the back. The bike just didn't run quite right. I had to add some more gaskets, and it just wasn't quite the same. That took a little bit of work and, pulling apart, rebuilding, and that was something that I never had an issue on my 21, but on my 23, it just seemed to be a little bit more finicky, given it's the first year of this bike, but that was just something that I had to work through. Was it necessarily a bad thing? No, but it wasn't just as simple as rebuilding the top end and having it be perfect like it was. I had to go through a little bit to figure it out. The next thing was setting the TPS. You had to go 0, full throttle, half throttle, hold for 3 to 6 seconds, and then let go. And you had to be very keen on that measurement of half throttle. And if you didn't do it perfectly, it wouldn't run quite right. So that took a little bit of, figuring out, was how do I get this, to be reset perfectly, and how do I get it to be exactly how it should be? That was something that I had to work through and figure out. On top of that, then you have your TPS monitoring and like your values, and that's down in your throttle body. And you either need a TPS tool that they offer, which is roughly like 150 bucks, and you got to set it up here and you got to adjust it and get it to, you know, back to like what stock was. And that just was like a little bit of added work that just kind of just was like one of those things that I was just like, oh, like I just want it to run right, you know, like not that like you didn't have to do that on the 21, and now you got to do that, and it's just finicky and it can get off easy. I just didn't love that, so that was kind of like a turn off to me. I just didn't love that I had to do that. I ended up having to bring it to my dealership to do that, and so I didn't love that. Another thing is that the FI light on your bike actually means something. When it's blinking codes at you if it stays on and does stuff. So having that, you know, actually, you know, on the 21, there was no such thing as a code. On the 23 and 24s, you have codes. And some of these codes can only be cleared by the dealership. So if you don't have a KTM Husky dealer within, you know, a reasonable, like for me, it's an hour to go to the dealership. So for me, it would be an hour there, hour back to drop it off, and then an hour there, hour back, 4 hours to get my bike serviced, brought in, fixed, whatever it may be. That was just something that ended up being a little bit more of a headache. And so through talking through, you know, a few of these items, some of this stuff added up for me, and personally it lessened the feel that I originally had for this bike. And ultimately, after some careful consideration, you know, I was just like, you know, I don't know if this is the bike for me. Hold. I think through like careful consideration of just, you know, having the bike and some of the things that I ran into, I did some test riding of other bikes this year just to dabble in, you know, see what's out there. You know, I've been on two strokes for a while, and got the 23, and I got the old bike, and I just kind of was, you know, going through like, I wonder what I'm going to do next year. You know, am I going to keep these? What am I going to do? Both bikes are starting to get higher hours. You know, what are we thinking? And so through some careful consideration, you know, I talked to my dealership and, you know, had some conversations with them, and ultimately we're making some moves for 24. We're doing something a little different, and this 23 is actually going to go up for sale. I loved it. I just had it serviced by the dealer. I just got it all completely freshened up. I've always ran really good gas in it. I've done really, you know, good things to it, kept meticulous care of it, and really treated this as a baby. But is it the bike that I want to race next year? It's not. And so through that, I've decided that I'm going to sell it, do something a little different, you know, switch things up. And so if you liked what you had to hear in this video, you liked what you heard in previous videos, and you like what I'm doing and you want to hear more, and obviously what we're doing here is lining up the next video, and that's going to be what we're going to, why we did it, and all of those things. And that's exciting. The 24 moves have already been put into motion, and we're already getting 24 lined up. It's December 3rd of 23. We're getting 24 lined up real quick. We've already made moves. And so if you liked this video, you found this information helpful, and maybe you want to hear more about what I have to say about my 24 moves, subscribe to the Dirt Bike Lifestyle, subscribe to JetBoyCo, and keep a lookout for the videos to come, because we're going to show you what we went to, why we made the decisions we made, and really take what I've said here and show you why I did what I did. And for those who haven't followed, now is the best time to follow, because it's only getting better from here. So I want to thank you guys for taking the time to watch this video, subscribing to JetBoyCo, drop a comment, let me know what you think about your 23 TC250, why you might be getting one, why you might be getting rid of one, maybe what you're thinking and feeling, and let me know. So without further ado, JetBoyCo merch coming January of 2024. Make sure to subscribe to JetBoyCo, follow JetBoyCo on social media so that you can get the drop when it comes. We've got a ton of cool stuff lined up, and I'm really excited for you guys all to join and watch that through. So without further ado, peace out, Dirt Bike Lifestyle. Thanks for watching.